Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville government, politics, news, education, business, whatever gets our attention. I am Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass, which covers all of the above, and you can find at CompassKnox.com. I am quasi-joined, not as usual, by Scott Barker, also co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. Hello, Scott. Can you hear us?
I can hear you, Jesse, although I'm a few hours away from Knoxville at the moment. I am mountains of North Carolina on assignment, headed toward... I've just got it on good authority that middle housing that's been missing is actually located on the beaches of the Tybee Island in Georgia. So I'm headed there.
You're gonna see if you can find the middle housing on Tybee Island and bring it back to Knoxville. Is that the plan here?
Well, I'm at least going to ask it why it left and does it plan to return.
All right. Well, I hope that you have some opportunity for a little bit of leisure time mixed in with what's obviously going to be a pretty business-heavy trip.
Oh, yeah. Well, pleasure has to take a back seat to business at all times.
That's
so
right.
I'll see what I can do.
That's our motto here at Compass.
Yeah.
Sadly. All right. Well, so we have several things we are going to talk about this week. We are, because we don't want to take up too much of Scott's travel time. We're going to do a couple of segments with him that we will sort of turn to over the course of the podcast. A fair amount of this is probably going to be me flying solo, so apologies to the big Scott Barker fan base. You're going to get less of Scott this week and more of me. He will be back in person next week.
I'm sure both of them will be disappointed. But of course, one of them is like sitting next to me, so
that's right.
There's only one other person that might be disappointed, but I think you'll be able to soldier on and do a quite capable job.
I'll say this, Scott. I actually had the occasion to meet Chief Noel for the first time this past week. Actually, right before we did our live show last week, and he mentioned to me that you were his favorite part of the show.
Oh goodness, well.
Or maybe I was paraphrasing. It was something close to that. Don't quote me on quoting him.
Well, I won't, but that's nice to hear.
It's that you bring that rich, buttery East Tennessee drawl to the show that it's just not the same without it.
Well, I try to ground us in place.
That's right. So among the things we have to talk about this week, some interesting news out of the state government, two different types of federal funding, one that the state is mad they're not getting, and another that the state is talking about giving up altogether. So we'll talk about those. A little follow-up on the ethics complaint against County Commissioner Kyle Ward that we have talked about here before. The City of Knoxville has presented its plan for that quote-unquote missing middle housing that Scott was just talking about. Interestingly, the city's plan does not involve anything to do with Tybee Island, but maybe Scott will be able to contribute something there. A lot of discussion at County Commission about a resolution against quote-unquote sexualizing children. What did that mean, and why did it not pass? And the school board is going to be looking at updating their annual action plan, and we will look at the draft results of the past year's action plan and see how close Superintendent Jon Rysewyk got to hitting some of the goals that were set last year. And that's what we'll be talking about this week. Okay, we will start off by talking a little bit about the school board's annual action plan, which it adopted last year for the first year of Superintendent Jon Rysewyk's tenure, and they will actually be voting on a new action plan for the current academic year at their meeting next week. But at a school board, they have an annual 2-day workshop that they gather for every year, and they did that at the end of September, and they got a sort of sneak preview of draft results of the data for this current year's action plan. And so the action plan sets out sort of broad goals across student achievement, teacher recruitment and retention, specifically serving various identified student groups that have particular needs or challenges. And then each of those has specific objectives with numbers attached to them. And so the school board kind of ran through. Now, not all the final numbers are in for these. I think they're going to be presented with the final numbers by the end of October, maybe November, and then all of that will go into the first actual annual evaluation of Rysewyk's performance by the board, which is supposed to take place this coming January. So this is kind of the first step in a multi-step process that will lead up to the superintendent's actual formal evaluation. But it's interesting to look at some of these. So they identified, as I said, 39 specific objectives, and then they kind of graded each of them in terms of whether those objectives were met or not during the 2022-23 school year. And 26 out of the 39 were met, so that's basically right at 2/3. And then there were another 12 where they fell short in, and then there's one particular one where they're still waiting for some data. But the, I guess on the plus side, and one of the things that Rysewyk really emphasized was that, there's been a lot of talk about third grade reading proficiency, both locally and statewide. It's a statistic that everybody pays a lot of attention to. And there was a goal to increase proficiency among third graders on the state's reading test by 1.9 percentage points, basically, over the course of the year, over the previous year. And actually, that number came in at 4.9%. It rose up to 43%. So more than double the increase that was set as the goal. At the same time, however, so that was just for third grade, if you looked at overall reading proficiency scores for grades 3 through 8, where each one of those grades every year students take the state reading TCAP, that fell short. That also had a goal to increase by 1.9 percentage points, and it only rose by 1.4 percentage points. So that could suggest various things. It could suggest that a lot of the extra effort and focus that has been placed on third grade instruction in recent years is, showing some results, and they did get a real jump there. Actually, that third grade number was higher than the state average overall. But that maybe some of those grades after third grade, 4th, 5th, 6th, et cetera, are areas that they're going to want to look at for, for extra attention and focus. Sort of a reverse situation with their math goals, where overall proficiency and this was looking at middle school math because that's really where they focus on math leading up to Algebra 1 in ninth grade. The proficiency levels for grades 6 through 8 overall grew by 4.4 percentage points, which actually doubled the goal of rising by 2.2 points. However, that Algebra 1 proficiency, which is kind of the major benchmark that they look at in terms of student aptitude and kind of readiness for graduation and so forth, that grew by 1.9 points, but the goal was 2.5 points. So it did grow, but it fell short. And of course, all of these metrics they're not picked out of a hat, that they are based on historical trends. They're based on state averages. They try to set them at levels that are realistic, but also ambitious, that if they meet them, that would show real growth. And so it's always kind of a little bit of a struggle, like where do you actually set the bar? Because you don't want to set it so high that you're just not going to clear it. On the other hand, you don't want to set it so low that you just kind of breeze through it without a lot of focus or attention. Overall, a lot of the areas that they achieved that Rysewyk and his administration achieved the goal in were areas of administrative movements, things that they could various kinds of training, various kinds of preparation for teachers and so forth, things that they could do in-house and kind of handle on their own. The areas where they had the greatest struggles were in the most difficult areas, which are always going to be your student achievement growth, and particularly for low-income students, for students with disabilities. That's where it's hardest to make real progress, but also areas that that arguably matter the most. And so, for example, both math and reading test scores rose for those quote-unquote underperforming student groups, but they fell short of their goals. So there was a 2.2 percentage point increase in math scores for the underperforming student groups, but there was a goal of 2.7%. And they had a goal of increasing reading proficiency for those groups by 2.5 percentage points, but it actually rose just barely, like 0.4%. They met some of their teacher recruitment and retention goals. For example, the goal of increasing teacher salaries by 4% a year. They did do that. They got a lot more people enrolled in what they're calling their grow your own teacher preparation programs, which are where they kind of take existing school system employees, existing students, or people in the community who are interested in becoming teachers and getting them enrolled in various kinds of teacher preparation courses. They saw a lot of success there. The Grow Your Own effort had a goal to increase their participation by 15%, and instead it rose by 181%. With 31 new people enrolled in those programs, up from just 11 the year before, which is kind of a drop in the bucket versus the total number of teachers that they have and the total number of teachers that they need. But still, if all 31 of those people go on to complete their certification and become full-time Knox County teachers, I mean, that's a pretty good cadre of teachers there. But the area that they really continue to struggle with in terms of teacher recruitment and retention is in looking to increase the number of teachers of color in the school system. They had a goal of raising that by 5%. Rysewyk has said that he very much believes in having teachers in schools that serve large minority populations who, look like the students who they're serving and who come from similar backgrounds as the students who they're serving, because there's data to suggest that students perform best in those circumstances where there's, sort of some natural sense of identification and understanding, empathy between the teachers and the students. They wanted to raise that by 5%, and instead it grew by just 1.9%, which actually boiled down to they added just 5 teachers net. It went from 268 teachers of color across the system to just 273. So that's an area that they're going to continue to put a lot of emphasis on. And looking ahead to the next year, as I said, the school board will be voting on the new action plan at its meeting next week, which maintains a lot of these same kind of percentage growth goals from the previous year. Some of them have been adjusted a little bit in areas where they kind of overperformed last year. They've raised those expectations a little bit because that shows that there's probably, areas where they can continue to see big gains. Some of the areas where they underperformed, they lowered them just slightly to try to, balance their expectations with what they think they can achieve. But I'm sure there will be more discussion of all of that at next week's school board meeting. And we had a whole article about this, kind of breaking all of that down, which you can find on our website. All right, really interesting discussion and vote at County Commission this past week. We talked last week about a resolution that County Commissioner Rhonda Lee brought that aimed to, quote, protect the innocence of children, unquote. And it basically said that County Commission and Knox County government will not support or fund anything that contributes to the, quote, sexualization of children, unquote. But it didn't really define what it meant by the sexualization of children. And there was a lot of discussion both at the work session 2 weeks ago and then at the actual voting meeting this past Monday about what this resolution really meant and also where it came from. And through our own reporting and also through some effort by some people in the community to kind of track this down, including Keith Britt, who is a candidate for Knox County Commission 4th District seat next year, running as a Democrat. He kind of dug into this and came up with some background on it, as did County Commissioner Larson J. And really, it turns out that this resolution originated in Ottawa County, Michigan. We talked about that a little bit last week, that Ottawa County is one of a handful of counties in the country that have gotten a lot of national media attention because they've really been taken over by this very kind of far-right, very culturally conservative, Christian conservative county commission. There's a group in Ottawa called the Ottawa Impact. They have a website. You can look them up. And they are now the majority on the county commission there. And they've been embroiled in various sort of combative discussions with their local health department and other things. And they passed this resolution this year. I actually talked to one of the members of the Ottawa County Commission, one of the two members of that commission who voted against this resolution there. And he said that resolution really came from people being apparently outraged that the county health department had a presence at the local LGBTQ Pride Festival, an event that year where they were, distributing literature on sexual health and, prevention of STIs. I'm not sure, maybe distributing condoms, that kind of thing. And there were some commissioners who just basically didn't like that there was any county presence at all at a Pride Festival. And so part of the response to that was passing this resolution forbidding county funds and county participation in support of anything, again, that would quote unquote sexualize children. And it's worth noting that phrase, sexualizing children, has become kind of a catchphrase on the cultural right in recent years. It's used in a lot of situations, but it most often revolves around, first of all, any kind of material that has any kind of sexual explicitness in it. So, books in school libraries, books in public libraries that people object to people under the age of 18 having access to, and then also really anything at all to do with LGBTQ people, like almost anything that even mentions the existence of LGBTQ people, somewhat in line with the quote-unquote don't say gay law, for example, that was passed in Florida. The idea that there's something inherently sexualizing about letting anybody under the age of 18 know that such things as gay people and trans people sort of even exist. So that was the background to this. And interestingly, it was brought to Knox County, and we talked to Eric Wyatter, who is a local conservative strategist and campaign consultant. And he was the campaign manager last year for County Commissioners Rhonda Lee and Gina Oster, as well as State Representative Elaine Davis, who all won their elections. And it was he confirmed that it was through him. He copied the resolution from Ottawa County in Michigan, and he provided it to Commissioner Lee, who was the one who introduced it here. And Commissioner Lee, in talking about this resolution and answering some questions that some of her colleagues had about it, said that, well, it's not just in Michigan, it's also been passed in Sumner County, Tennessee. And she was kind of arguing that, that showed that, yes, this was a proper and reasonable resolution for a Tennessee County Commission to consider. But the interesting thing about that being passed in Sumner County is that it turns out Eric Weider is also the one who provided the resolution to Sumner County. And how did it get to Sumner County via Eric Weider? Well, Steve Weiner, who some listeners and local political junkies may remember, used to live in Knox County and ran for county commission last year against Commissioner Larson J. in the Republican primary and lost. He actually moved to Sumner County earlier this year. He's an attorney and is now the deputy law director in Sumner County. Sumner County, Tennessee is another one of these handful of counties around the country that has also been taken over by a fairly far-right group. They call themselves constitutional conservatives, and they basically, a whole group of them got together and ran out the sitting Republican incumbents in Sumner County, and now have a majority on the Sumner County Commission. And so this resolution having been provided to them by Steve Weiner via Eric Weider, they went ahead and passed it this month. And so, it was arguably a little bit disingenuous of Lee to kind of cite Sumner County, knowing that, well, yes, Sumner County passed it because it came from the same source that she herself got it from. And initially, she had agreed to tone down the resolution. The county law department had a lot of concerns about kind of legality of this resolution and what kinds of restrictions it could place on county programming and funding and so forth, because it was so vague, because it didn't really define what it meant by sexualizing children, but it was going to restrict county funds and activities. And so she had initially agreed to take out the part saying that, the county was restricted from doing any of this, and it was just going to be sort of a general statement of principle. We do not support sexualizing children. But then at Monday's meeting, she actually moved to put the language back, saying, no, we really want this to restrict funding, to restrict any participation by county employees. And that was at the encouragement and urging of a local group called Knox for Liberty. A member of that group, Sherry Garrett, spoke at the Knox County Commission meeting last Monday. And some folks may remember Sherry Garrett ran for school board last year in the 7th district. She lost in the Republican primary to Steve Triplett. She was also very active in the anti-mandate, anti-school mask requirement movement over the previous couple of years. And she's involved with this group, Knox for Liberty. And they're a very, again, culturally conservative, religious conservative group. And she spoke at the meeting in favor not just of the resolution, but of the stronger version of it, saying that the county really should restrict any kind of funds or support going to any activities that, quote unquote, sexualize children. And, one of the interesting things here was that the resolution itself did not say anything about library books, did not say anything about LGBTQ people, but the people who spoke at public forum on the resolution, both in favor of it and against it, basically all seemed to agree that, yes, that was what it was about, that this resolution really was about wanting to get things out of school libraries and wanting to get any kind of county participation away from anything to do with LGBTQ people. There were people who spoke against it, who included Keith Britt, who I mentioned earlier. They were basically saying, this is kind of a witch hunt, and this is trying to stir up division and fear in the community, specifically against LGBTQ people. And then the people who spoke in favor of it said that they wanted to pass this because they wanted to take books out of school libraries and out of public libraries. And Sherry Garrett said she had found a couple of books that were available to young people that were inappropriate, and she wanted the county to take them out. So, I mean, basically saying, yes, this is about banning books, and kind of here's the books we want to ban. And then another speaker got up and just flatly said, LGBTQ is an abomination. And this is the word of God, and county commission needed to heed the word of God. So despite the vagueness of the resolution, there really wasn't a lot of mystery about what was being talked about here. And that level of rhetoric clearly made a lot of members of county commission kind of uncomfortable. You know, Commissioner Jay spoke up and said that he felt like this was really kind of a political ploy. It was forcing people either to support something that was pretty vague but could then be used to do things like try to take books out of libraries or restrict county funding to various kinds of organizations or activities, but without spelling out on the front end what those things were going to be. Or if people voted against it, then that could be used against them in future, you know, campaigns and campaign ads saying so-and-so voted, you know, to support the sexualization of children. And so for those reasons, Commissioner Jay made a motion to just table it. I think recognizing that forcing commissioners to vote for or against it was something that a lot of commissioners weren't necessarily going to be comfortable with, whereas just voting to table it said, you know what, we're just not going to take any action on this. We're going to set it aside. And it was tabled to a time indefinite, which basically means it's functionally dead unless somebody moves at some future point to bring it back for consideration. And what was interesting about it, a lot of commissioners did speak up about it, and kind of everybody, and this went to kind of what Jay was saying about how uncomfortable the framing of this was for anybody to oppose it. Kind of everybody who spoke about it had to preface it by saying, I am not in favor of the sexualization of children. You know, I'm a parent, I'm a grandparent. Of course, I don't think children should have access to, you know, quote unquote inappropriate materials. But the point that lots of them made was that, you know, what qualifies as appropriate or inappropriate past a certain point, you know, obviously we have laws that restrict the availability of, you know, obscene materials to children and so forth. So we already have those laws on the books. But once you go beyond those laws, a lot of what you're getting into is people's judgment calls and, you know, their worldviews and their parenting philosophies. And, you know, certainly what kinds of materials some parents feel comfortable with their kids having access to at certain ages, you know, that varies tremendously. Based on people's religious views, their sort of social or moral views or whatever. At what age is it okay for kids to watch R-rated movies? You know, well, actually, kids of any age can see an R-rated movie in a movie theater as long as they're accompanied by an adult. We already leave a lot of those kinds of decisions up to parents. And County Commissioner Gina Oster, the vice chair, who, as I said, was actually one of the candidates who Eric Weider was her campaign manager last year. But she said, you know, I'm a Republican and I'm a conservative, sort of in terms of moral values. But she said, I'm also a conservative in terms of my view of government and thinking that, you know, she's in favor of quote unquote smaller government and against government overreach. And she said she kind of felt like a lot of what was being talked about here really was government overreach, that it was getting into trying to police individual families' decisions based on, you know, somebody's particular philosophy or set of beliefs. And Commissioner Courtney Durrett said, you know, if we pass this, like, where does it stop? Are we going to, we have 60,000 school children across Knox County. Are we going to be going out knocking on people's doors and asking, you know, what TV shows or video games or movies or music or whatever they allow their children to have access to? And that she just didn't really feel like this was the proper role of government. And I think also more broadly, there was a resistance, it seemed, on commission to getting drawn into what they all saw as, you know, kind of a symbolic culture war battle that they weren't sure was really the proper role of county commission. So Jay's motion to table the resolution actually passed on a 9-1 vote Commissioner Lee was the only one to vote against tabling it. Even Commissioner Carson Daly, who had co-sponsored the resolution with Lee, voted to table it. And then Commissioner Kyle Ward was not present at the meeting, and so that's why there were only 10 total votes. But, on the one hand, I think you can say that was a pretty strong message from Commission that they don't really want to be drawn into these kinds of national culture war campaigns. But obviously, we do have the Knox for Liberty group is out there. There is discussion. You can certainly find it out there on various local Facebook groups about people wanting to challenge the availability of certain books in school libraries, in public libraries, and maybe wanting to limit the activities of, say, the Knox County Health Department in some arenas. And so I think that just because this one resolution was tabled does not mean that we won't see sort of further efforts along these lines. One thing that Commission Chair Terry Hill said was, that she wasn't comfortable with the resolution, but she did say, if people think the county is funding specific activities that are inappropriate or materials that are inappropriate or whatever, that people should bring specific complaints about those things, because then at least people would know what was being talked about. So maybe we will see that either at the school board or at county commission. Certainly there are clearly sort of some people and interest groups in the community wanting to dig into all of that a little bit, and it may well be something that we will see more of. But this kind of initial effort to pull the county government into these issues did not get a very receptive audience on county commission, and we'll just have to see what happens in the future. All right, now we are going to turn back to our friend Scott Barker to talk to us about this middle housing plan that Mayor India Kincannon has been talking about for some time in the city. And there was a formal presentation of that plan at a work session for City Council this week, as well as a couple of open house meetings for the public. So, Scott, we've talked about this whole sort of missing middle subject a lot this year. It's also been the focus of some discussion during the campaigns for City Council and for Mayor. So what's the plan?
Well, the plan, Jesse, is to change the zoning code to allow developers or property owners to build duplexes, triplexes, small apartment buildings, not big complexes, but just, 2-story, 6-8 unit buildings in the older neighborhoods of Knoxville, basically between the Tennessee River and the I-640 bypass. The neighborhoods are the Mechanicsville and Old North Knoxville and Oakwood Lincoln Park, and then in East Knoxville would be Park Ridge and Morningside and those neighborhoods. So that the idea is to both increase density and to make more options available for people. The one of the things is the population is growing. If after a couple of decades of stagnant growth, the last 14 years or so, the city's really taken off, growing, and the demographics. And this is one of the things that the Kincannon administration brought out at the meeting. 4 in 10 households in Knoxville actually just have one person, and 8 in 10 don't have any children below the age of 18 who live at home. So there isn't the need necessarily for 3 and 4 bedroom houses and things like that. So these smaller multi-family houses like duplexes and triplexes, there's a perceived need for those. So this would allow those to be built.
Yeah, I want to give an anecdotal example of this. It's interesting. As we've been talking about this issue, I've realized that I grew up with a model of this. My grandmother lived in Winnetka, a suburb of Chicago. She was a school teacher, and her husband died when she was relatively young, like while my mom was still in high school. And so my grandmother then lived on her own for the rest of her life. And the entire time that I knew her and remember going to her house growing up and everything, she lived in a little set of row houses. I think there were 5 or 6 of them right in a row. Took up about half a block of a residential neighborhood there. And that was also, I remember at least 2 of her neighbors in that row of row houses were also, sort of older people, middle-aged and older, who were living on their own there. And obviously it provided plenty of space for her, and I think probably gave her a much more affordable option than she would have had in what was a fairly pricey suburb.
Yeah, that's one of the scenarios that the administration will bring out, is that if you wanted to build a duplex and you could live in one side and a senior parent or parents could live on the other side, or a college age student, if you have a child who's college age, they could live on the other side, or you could rent it out as income. So it's there are all kinds of scenarios where that would work. These would all go in the RN1 or RN2, 3, and 4 zones in these neighborhoods. And these particular neighborhoods have about a quarter of the city's residential properties, and then and all told, right now there are about 2,000 vacant lots in those neighborhoods, in those areas. So they're taken together. I mean, they're all spread out. These vacant lots are spread out through all these neighborhoods, and they're not all together. But taken together, that's 2,000, potentially 2,000 units. If only 10% get built on, that's another 200 housing units in the in the basically center city. So, but this was the formal presentation to City Council, the first time that council members have had a chance to, in public at least, ask questions and make comments. It was kind of interesting. For the most part, it was kind of well received. One of the things, and then the administration really emphasizes that this is not the end all be all for addressing the housing shortage in Knoxville. This is, they kept saying it's one piece of the puzzle. That's one of the things the mayor said. It's one tool in the toolbox. All of those kinds of cliches that people trot out like that. But it's getting kind of an inordinate amount of attention, especially because it's just a zoning change, zoning amendment. It's not really a proposal to spend public money and do things like that, but it does affect a lot of neighborhoods. And I think that's that's one of the reasons that it's getting so much attention, is that as I said, it's a quarter of the residential area of the city, essentially. So, these neighborhoods are dense. They're little smaller lots. They have sidewalks. They have traditional street grids, those kinds of things. A lot of them have alleys. So, and these housing types there would be design guidelines to make sure that they fit in with the other houses. It's not like there's going to be a 4-story building in the middle of a 1- and 2-story house and 1- and 2-story streets. I mean, buildings. It's all going to be 2 stories will be the max for any of these. So, but there were a lot of questions, some concerns. Some city council members, Billy Parker, Sim Singh, and Gwen McKenzie, are concerned about the impact on low-income residents. Some of these neighborhoods have a lot of low-income residents, and a lot of them people of modest means live there, and so they're concerned about driving up property values, which drives up property taxes, and people living on fixed incomes have a difficult time paying those already. Those kinds of concerns, kind of have been raised. A lot of, and then on the other end of the spectrum, at Council Member Tommy Smith, who wants it to be expanded to go to RN1 zones, which are basically the single-family homes you hear about, that most people think of when they think of neighborhoods that are getting built today, and apply perhaps in other parts of the city, which would tremendously expand the amount. I don't think that's going to. There's much of an appetite for that, but that's one of the things that he suggested. And
do you think that sort of politically the reason for starting with the more central, older city neighborhoods is that those neighborhoods are less likely to object to this, because a lot of those neighborhoods actually have legacy, what we now call middle housing, but older buildings that were built sort of pre-World War II, before our zoning codes got so restrictive about single family zoning, but that maybe there would be less pushback in, let's say, my neighborhood of Oakwood Lincoln Park than in, say, West Hills or Sequoia Hills and those kinds of places.
Yeah, well, one thing is, I think there are a couple of reasons. These neighborhoods do have the majority of the middle housing stock, and this is housing that's in between a single family detached home and a big apartment complex. These are the things that are in between, which is why it's called middle housing. And most of the city's existing middle housing stock are in the older neighborhoods, the ones that were developed before World War II. And so, yeah, they're people who live in Oakwood Lincoln Park or Old North Knoxville or Mechanicsville are more familiar with those types of housing. And I know the street I live on, I live in Bell Morris, the street I live on, we have two duplexes side by side, practically kind of catty corner across the street from me. There are a couple of small apartment buildings in the neighborhood, so it's not, for me and my neighbors, it wouldn't be anything any different. So, and like I said, in West Hills and Holston Hills and most of Fountain City, it would be a completely different story. And part of it is, and a lot of those neighborhoods like West Hills and Holston Hills, two examples, have very active neighborhood associations who tend to think that, or they speak out a lot about any kind of development that is in or near their neighborhoods, and they have a tendency to want to keep things the way they are. So,
right, and those are the places where there's been the most resistance to things like auxiliary dwelling units, short-term rentals, and really any kind of move toward greater density.
Yeah, but one of the things, and one of the reasons there is that political dimension about not expanding it too far out before, at least initially, when they roll it out. But also there is a real practical reason too, and that is the city is basing a lot of this on a study by a firm called Opticos Design, was a consultant that they used. And one of the things that they emphasize is these types of housing work best in walkable neighborhoods where there are sidewalks. There is that grid. There's a pretty close proximity to, at least within walking distance in many instances, to businesses where you can shop or eat or whatever. And most of the businesses around the downtown area, which is what we're talking about, have all of that. West Hills, Holston Hills. If you live in the middle of the Holston Hills, you've got a pretty long haul to walk someplace to eat or something like that. So, I mean, it really would be appropriate at this stage for those types of areas. So, on a practical matter, as well as, has the added benefit of it removes some potentially loud and vigorous voices of dissent.
Right. Well, and so, as you said, the city has said this is only one piece of the puzzle, and there has been some discussion. Tim Hill, who's a developer who's running for city council and does residential development, he's built apartment buildings and that kind of thing. He's kind of made the case that, missing middle is getting too much attention for the relatively small impact that it can have, and that if you really want to add housing units, the way to do that is in big apartment complexes, condo complexes, whatever, but buildings with lots of units in them, and the city is especially talking about trying to encourage those around or along our existing commercial corridors.
That was one of the other things that council members brought up. While it wasn't directly tied to this particular proposal, they did bring up Andrew Roberto, the vice mayor, Lauren Ryder, Charles Thomas. They all brought up, the need for Lynn Fugit. They all brought up the need for development along corridors. They really see, especially some of the big box stores that are either empty or really underutilized once the tenant who they were built for has moved on to somewhere else. They really look there for the possibility of building large scale developments that everybody knows. I mean, it's just obvious that I mentioned that this. There are 2,000 or so lots that would be suitable for, they're empty right now, that would be suitable for this missing middle housing. Well, you could, a couple of big apartment complexes takes care of 2,000 units right there. So they are right about that. And that's why the administration said this is one piece of the puzzle. That's while they didn't come out and say that, we are going to really push for development along the corridors. That is, development elsewhere is part of what they're talking about, along with affordable housing. This housing is not necessarily affordable housing. This is going to be, whatever people build. You can't really dictate affordable housing through zoning. In fact, it's against the law to do that. So, so that is not. I mean, it could happen that these are more affordable units than otherwise would be built, but that doesn't take the place of these dedicated affordable housing complexes that are built from time to time. That the city this year they have $7.5 million set aside to help developers build affordable housing. So that's another component. There are various components of housing. This is one of them. And it does get a little, as I mentioned before, it is getting a little bit too much, I don't know too much, but it's getting a lot of attention for what is essentially just a revision to a zoning code that affects a quarter of the city.
Right. All right. So the first hearing or action on this will be next week at the Planning Commission, and then assuming it comes through Planning Commission, it would go to City Council for adoption, right? Yeah,
it will come back to City Council probably in October or in November for a vote. At the Planning Commission will hear it at their October meeting, and then usually it's a couple of weeks or several weeks after Planning Commission before it actually goes to City Council for an actual vote. Right now, like I said, Council was generally receptive to it. There are some who kind of had some questions about it. I don't want to read too much into the tea leaves yet, but there'll probably be a couple of dissenters. But I think that that in general, the desire to go ahead and do something to positive, not necessarily that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's to take action to address the housing situation. I think there's a lot of desire to do that.
Okay, well, there was sort of interesting development this week following up on something we've talked about in previous weeks, which is this ethics complaint that was filed against County Commissioner Kyle Ward over his involvement with developer Scott Davis in a project on a couple of vacant lots in a subdivision in West Knox County. And basically the complaint was brought by, there are a couple of vacant lots in a subdivision that is already otherwise all built out. And these couple of lots haven't been developed because they're sort of not really attractive pieces of property. They have steep drop-offs at their backside, which really limits what can be built there. But basically, Scott Davis, who's a well-known residential developer in Knox County and also a very politically active residential developer, entered into an agreement with Ward, who in his private life outside of county commission owns a waste disposal company and also does sort of project by project development. And basically Ward agreed to take possession of these properties and build them out, build a house on the two of them or a house on each of the two lots, and then sell them. And then out of the proceeds, he would pay Davis $40,000 a piece for the lots and pay off the construction loan, obviously. And then, Ward would make whatever money was left at the end of that deal. And so the initial complaint about this kind of cited the fact that the actual transaction, this was a quitclaim deal where Davis essentially signed over these properties to Ward for a nominal fee of $10. And so the complaint was that Davis is a very active developer who often brings projects to county commission for rezonings or variances and those kinds of things, and that it was improper, that he was basically making a gift of these two parcels to Ward because they were looking at that $10 fee. Now, after that complaint was filed, Ward and Davis filed a contract that they say was signed the same day as the quitclaim deed that basically said that Ward is going to have to pay $40,000 a piece for those parcels once they're built out. And so because of that, County Law Director David Book, who advises the County Ethics Committee, told the Ethics Committee that he just didn't see a viable violation, that basically even if everything in the complaint was true, that the existence of this contract shows that this is just a normal business deal. It doesn't violate the county's ethics code, that Ward is, even though he's a county commissioner, he's allowed to also conduct private business. There was no allegation that Davis, as a developer, was receiving anything back from this, no specific quid pro quo. And so Book just said there really is no violation here. And then there was a separate allegation then that because Ward had been looking for a variance on these lots in order to build closer to the front lot line, and he had gone to the County Board of Zoning Appeals in August trying to get that variance. And one of the members of the Board of Zoning Appeals was Garrett Holt, who Ward had actually appointed to his seat on the Board of Zoning Appeals. And Holt is now running for that 4th district seat that Ward currently holds. Ward is not running for re-election next year. Ward has endorsed Holt. He has made a campaign donation to him. And so there was a complaint also that this was improper, that Holt shouldn't be allowed to vote on this because of that relationship. And again, Book looked at that and said, again, no ethics violation here because, first of all, campaign donations are not considered gifts or favors or anything under the county ethics policy. They're explicitly exempted from that. And just because somebody has given a campaign donation to somebody does not create a conflict of interest under the ethics code, that's just somebody exercising their right to participate in local government. And also the fact that Holt was named to the board, was nominated to the board by Ward. Well, all of the members of the Board of Zoning Appeals are nominated by district commission representatives. So everybody on the Board of Zoning Appeals was nominated by some commissioner. And, again, Book said that didn't create any kind of actionable ethics violation. So the ethics committee did not take any action on this. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. But they gave the complainant, who, again, is a neighbor of one of these properties that Ward owns, who doesn't want anything built there, they gave him until the ethics committee's November meeting to bring back more specifics to allege something that might actually be a violation of the county ethics code. And for now, the ethics committee just didn't take any action on that. So somewhat unusually, instead of waiting for that November meeting to see if anything happens, this past week, ethics committee chair Michael Covington went ahead and filed a complaint himself with the state comptroller's office, asking them to investigate this. And Covington had been, during the ethics committee hearing on this, he had been sort of the most outspoken voice and saying, he thought that something about this didn't look right. And he kind of made some allegations that Book himself might be conflicted somehow with Ward. That was kind of vague. He said he had heard some things from another county commissioner, but then he wouldn't say exactly what those things were or who the county commissioner was who had told him these things. But, he kind of was pounding the table a little bit about this complaint and saying he thought there was something here that they should look at and so forth. And so, kind of having failed to get the committee to take action on it, Covington just went ahead and filed his own complaint directly with the state comptroller's office, which investigates wrongdoing by, public officials across the state. And we don't know if the comptroller's office will actually conduct an investigation. That's up to them. They, have their own process for looking at complaints. They will never confirm whether they are conducting an investigation. So you never really know if they are or not until, occasionally you'll kind of hear things from people, back channels, that, the comptroller's in town, they're talking to people about this or whatever. But publicly, there wouldn't be any announcement of anything unless and until they conduct an investigation and then release the results of it. So we don't really have any way of knowing. It's also possible the comptroller's office looks at it and looks at Book's opinion on it and says, yeah, we agree with the county law director. We don't see anything here. And that could be the end of it. The interesting thing really about this is the role of Michael Covington, because, casual observers of local government, his name may not be familiar, but to those of us who have been around it and pay attention to it for a long time, it's a very familiar name. And he's kind of in this category of people who are sort of like perennial candidates. He has run for at least the state legislature. He ran in the 15th district. He ran for city council in the 6th district. He ran for county commission in the 1st district. In the partisan, and all of those are kind of like the center city districts, majority minority districts. Covington himself is black, but interestingly, he's also Republican. And so he's in this sort of narrow category of black Republicans in Knox County who we sometimes see who, run for a lot of seats, get on a lot of ballots, and don't get elected because they're Republicans running in majority Democratic districts. And that has been the case with all of Covington's campaigns. But it gives them sort of a little bit of stature within the local Republican Party, because the Republican Party, like the Democratic Party, likes to have candidates on ballots. They don't necessarily put a lot of money into those candidates. I don't think any of Covington's campaigns have ever been very well funded. But then also, you get connected to people get to know your name, and then you get appointed to boards. And so Covington was appointed to the Knox County Ethics Committee and then eventually elected chair of it. And I'm not going to say that he's grandstanding on this complaint, but I'm not going to say that he's not grandstanding on this complaint. Definitely, he conducted the Ethics Committee hearing last month in a fairly aggressive manner. He started it out, as I said, by kind of bringing in these external rumors that he'd heard that weren't even mentioned in the actual complaint they had before them. And then he wouldn't even cite a source for the things he said he heard.
So what you're saying is, even though the body is intended to not be involved in politics by overseeing politics, it's automatically involved in politics.
Well, it certainly can be involved in politics.
It's hard to separate the two. I think it's the least the moral of the story. Like,
it is. It can be very hard to separate the two.
If we could just figure out how to just pull random strangers off the street to sit on these ethics boards that don't know or don't pay attention to any of this stuff, because I get it. I mean, it's one of those. It's natural in the system. If you're a person like me who is not doesn't have a media need to stay separated but is interested and involved, my politics are on board. So
right.
if I can get it, and a Kyle Ward who is my commissioner is not going to put me anoint me to a position without it being at least somewhat beneficial to his end goals. That's just natural. It's how it's going to work. And so how else are we going to get these bodies filled?
Yeah, I mean, these kind of appointed bodies, which are, the ethics committee is a volunteer body. They don't get paid to do it or anything, and they don't even meet that often. This was a special called meeting because they actually had a complaint. Other than that, I think they have quarterly meetings where often some of those meetings even get canceled because they don't have anything to talk about.
That sounds like a committee I want to be on.
Yeah, right.
All right, whoever replaces Kyle, hit me up. I might get in on this one.
Well, and you could say, like in Covington's defense, you could say that, well, he's just taking this seriously. He's taking his role seriously. He's not just going to take the word of the county law department for it. He wants to look into it more. But again, for those of us who have kind of been around and seen Michael Covington in action, it's hard to miss the sense of a certain amount of kind of like self-promotion going on as well. So, he's certainly not making any friends with anybody, certainly not with Kyle Ward or David Book by filing this complaint with the comptroller's office. He probably doesn't care about that. And again, he I'm sure would say that I'm just doing my due diligence. I'm kind of curious what the rest of the ethics committee is going to think about this, because they met, they did not take action on this, and then their chairman just went ahead on his own and filed this complaint. A little bit unusual.
Just a quick a question in the logistics of process here. Could our original complainant have gone straight to the comptrollers and skipped the local ethics board, or
yes. Yeah, people can file. I mean, well, and that's Covington filed a complaint as a citizen. He wasn't filing a complaint as an official. I mean, he may have put on there that he's the chair of the ethics committee or something, but that doesn't give him any particular standing.
Got it.
So yeah, citizens can file complaints, sure. And again, just because people file, the comptroller's office gets lots and lots of complaints. Just because people file complaints does not necessarily mean they launch a full investigation. They have their own review process that they go through because they have limited resources like everybody, and they're going to focus on things where they think there may be real issues to dig into. We will see if this is one of those. Maybe there will be more to come out of this that will make it look more damning than it kind of looks so far. What it kind of looks like so far is some neighbors who don't want development on a lot next to them, who are using any means that they have, protesting at the Board of Zoning Appeals meeting, filing an ethics complaint, just kind of anything that they can grab hold of to try to fight against.
With a government official who, through his job, has expanded his personal network into things. And because I had Kyle Ward on my show many moons ago, and I remember him talking about, he mentioned, I can't remember the specifics, but he had mentioned that him and his wife had done properties and stuff like that before. It's not a foreign concept to him. Mm-hmm. It's something that's in his wheelhouse. And through being a commissioner for now almost 3.5 years, he's met a lot of people, developers being one of those, and people who own property being one of those. And where you or I might not have the opportunity to meet this Davis character and have this conversation with him, because of his seat, he has a network of that now. And
absolutely.
And again, I could smell it. It smells fishy. I get it.
Right.
But it's not necessarily a violation.
Right. And that's what Book said. I mean, right. There's no credit. First of all, Davis did support Ward when he ran for county commission. Davis donated to Ward, which again is not developers donate to candidates all the time. They're one of the most active groups in the county. And the fact that just because a developer has donated to your campaign as a county commissioner doesn't mean that you have to recuse yourself when that developer comes and appears before county commission. Lots of people if county commissioners, city council members had to recuse themselves every time anything potentially benefited one of their donors, they could probably never vote on anything because they all have donors who all have interests of one kind or another.
Right. And you could use it as a convenient political tool to avoid voting on something that you don't want to. Hey, come speak on this thing so that I have to recuse myself so I can not have to be on record on a side of this.
Right. Now, did Davis's relationship, friendship, business relationship, whatever, with Scott Davis arise out of the connection that they made when Ward ran for office and his time on commission? I mean, sure, that's certainly possible, and those things happen. And what Book said is that, again, like, being friends with somebody is not an ethics violation. And county commissioners it's a part-time job. They get paid, I forget how much,
right, but the majority of the job is meeting people and interacting with their
right.
constituents, and one of those constituents happens to be this guy. He's
networking. Allowed to have his own business, and like most people on county, well, some of them are retired, but most people on county commission have, other jobs and other businesses and things they're involved in. They are allowed to do that. Where it becomes a problem is if they are given something, they're given something of value, and by somebody who is somehow does business with the county or is regulated by the county. Scott Davis would qualify as that. He's a developer. Developers are regulated by the county. Scott Davis appears before county commission a fair amount, like I said. But in this case, it doesn't appear, and, again, per David Book's look at it.
There's no straight line from this gift
because he's not
to
being
an item.
Given it. If Davis really did give those properties to Ward for $10, that definitely could have been an ethics violation, because Davis is somebody who is regulated by the county. But is Kyle Ward allowed to buy property from Scott Davis? Yes, he is. And, at fair market value, the $40,000 per lot that he has a contract to pay him for is, not quite at their appraised value. I think the combined appraised value of the two lots is $92,000, but appraisals are estimates more or less.
Right. We all
there's
went
no
through our
absolute
appraisals.
value that any piece of property is worth. 40,000, the combined 80,000 for the two properties is definitely within the ballpark of their appraised value. And so that's what Book said is it's like, you can't really look at this and say this is a gift. It's saying you can buy these from me at sort of reasonable market rate. He's allowed to do that. Not a violation. The relationship with Garrett Holt on the Board of Zoning Appeals, which Holt has now actually resigned from the Board of Zoning Appeals just this past month in order to focus on his campaign for county commission. But again, no obvious violations of the ethics policy there, the code of ethics. But we will see. Maybe, the comptroller's office will come in and poke around and turn over some stones and find something interesting. We will find out. One other thing I wanted to hit on, there were two different news items this week that were interesting in and of themselves, but also in sort of like their contrast with each other. The first was it came out that the federal government is providing something called Title X funds that had been going to the state of Tennessee until this year, and we're talking about $7 million a year in funding, $7 to $8 million a year in funding that had been going to the state of Tennessee to support basically family planning, reproductive health efforts, provide birth control, STD screenings, kind of that whole world of reproductive health care, and provide those services to low-income residents of the state. That money had been going to the state. However, after Tennessee passed its absolute ban on abortion, which we have in this state, an absolute ban on abortion, the state basically prohibited those functions, the agencies providing those services from discussing abortion because it's illegal in Tennessee. It's a felony in Tennessee. And the federal regulations say that because one of the things that this funding pays for is pregnancy tests. And so the federal regulations say that in order to qualify for this funding, when people take a pregnancy test and they test positive, showing that they're pregnant, it is required that the healthcare providers inform them of all of the options that are available to them. You know, if here's how to have a healthy pregnancy, if that's your goal and your desire. But that also, it is legal in the United States, if not in Tennessee, to have an abortion, to terminate a pregnancy, and that patients have to be informed of that. And the state of Tennessee disagreed with that and said, no, this is a felony crime in our state. We are not going to inform people of this. And the federal government said, or earlier this year said, okay, well, you don't get your money. And this was a bit of a deal back in April, and Governor Bill Lee actually added some money, about $7 million, to the state budget of state funds to help support these programs because of that loss of federal funds. So what came out this past week is that that money is actually still going to come to Tennessee, but it's not going to come through the state. And it is going to come through the one organization that is probably the most hated, abhorred, insulted organization in the whole country by a lot of cultural conservatives and Republicans in the state legislature, which is Planned Parenthood. And through a couple of different grants with other nonprofits, Planned Parenthood of Tennessee and North Mississippi is going to be the sub-grantee recipient of about $7.8 million in funding that it will then use not to provide abortions. And again, this funding was never to provide abortions. That's not what it does. It provides birth control, STD screenings, pregnancy tests, etc. And those are all services that Planned Parenthood does still provide in Tennessee. Of course, they don't provide abortions in Tennessee any longer, but they do provide all those services. And so this money is going to come to them. And a little bit of a windfall for Planned Parenthood in Tennessee to continue to provide those services. And Governor Bill Lee was not happy about this. Came out and blasted the feds, basically, for using the excuse of the state's abortion ban in order to fund a, quote, radical organization, by which, of course, he meant Planned Parenthood. Tennessee Right to Life, the leading anti-abortion group in the state, also furious about this, that, the federal government, the Biden administration, is using, in their view, sort of a...
it's a workaround. They're just trying to,
a workaround, a backdoor deal.
There you go.
To get money into Tennessee and into the hands of an organization that the Biden administration supports, but that the Lee administration absolutely, undeniably, unquestionably opposes in every way. So a lot of angst about that for conservatives in the state, and the Planned Parenthood folks obviously were quite happy about this, going to provide resources for them to then provide services to people. So that was one issue. At the same time that discussion was going on this past week, Speaker of the House Cameron Sexton and Senate Majority Leader Lieutenant Governor Randy McNally announced the formation of a committee of state legislators to investigate and look into whether Tennessee should opt out of a whole other much bigger pot of federal funding, which is the approximately $2 billion a year that Tennessee gets every year in education funding from the Federal Department of Education. And this was something that got talked about this past legislative session. Sexton came out and basically said, there's too many strings attached to federal funding. I don't think he's said specifically which strings he has in mind, like what kinds of things are required by the federal government that he wants Tennessee schools to be able to opt out of. But basically saying there's too many strings attached to federal education funding, and also Tennessee is kind of sitting on a historic budget surplus right now, and maybe we ought to look into just giving up this federal funding completely and getting out of the federal mandates that come along with it, and we can make it up with state funds. Now, that's a fair amount of money to make up with state funds. The state, even under Governor Lee's new funding formula, which added about $1 billion a year, in state funding for K-12 education in the state, that's still, it brought it up to, I believe, between $7 and $8 billion from the state. And then, we get another couple billion from the feds on top of that. So, you're talking about 20 to 25% of the total state education budget that's coming from the federal government. Not a small number, no matter how big the state's surplus is. And then the other question that a lot of people have had about this is, well, if the state says, yes, we're going to make this up themselves, what does that mean, make it up? Because that federal money is very specifically targeted through specific programs. A lot of it goes to pay for nutrition, for school lunches and breakfast and food for low-income students. A lot of it goes to support services to special education students. A lot of it goes through the Title I program to schools that just have high percentages of low-income students in general. So those federal funds very specifically are there to support and provide services and resources to a lot of the neediest, most vulnerable, most disadvantaged children in Tennessee. And the concern that some people have raised about this, I mean, one concern is, would the state really actually make up the money? Can the state actually afford to do that? And then the other question is, even if they do make up that money, is it going to go to the same students? And those schools that receive that, now they're all over the state. There's low-income populations all over the state, rural counties, urban counties, et cetera. But they are heavily concentrated in a lot of the urban areas. Memphis in particular has a very high number of low-income students. Knoxville certainly does. Nashville does, et cetera. Those are not areas that are represented in the legislature for the most part by Republicans, and they are areas that the state legislature has shown a certain disregard to, let's say, in terms of wanting to fund and support them in various ways. And so, I think it's a legitimate question whether a legislative supermajority that is heavily dominated by suburban and rural legislators would, given the opportunity to design their own program, design a program that so heavily focuses on and so heavily funds schools and populations in particularly in urban areas.
Okay, so I've got to kind of this may be beyond the pale as far as what's available information-wise, but the old funding model and the new funding model both have the capacity index or whatever that they
fiscal
add to
capacity, yeah.
Yeah, and so which basically means that your largest commercial locations, which is your Nashville, Memphis, Knoxville breakdown, are already getting a less cut because we can make it up is the format.
Right.
And so I don't know, I was just thinking while you were talking about that, if the state's already kind of doing that, would this then take more out of the more populated areas, or would it make more available to these said populated areas because they're not now getting the force split as things are? I don't know. It's just
because the federal funding is not allocated according to fiscal capacity. It's allocated according to federal formulas, and so that's the state funding. That is right. The state funding is already. I mean, if anything, it could exacerbate that issue, where a county like Knox County, because it's a relatively prosperous county, gets a little bit lower percentage of its school budget from state funding, because the assumption is that, well, if you need more money, you can raise your taxes. You've got a big tax base. If you need more money, you can raise your taxes to pay for it, which, of course, Knox County has not raised its property taxes in, I forget, what are we at now, 23, 24 years. But we have the capacity to. There's a lot of money sitting out there in Knox County that, from the state's point of view in its formula, is not being utilized, but is available if the county decided to. And so the federal money is not subject to that. It comes to those schools based on
by the breakdown of the responsibilities of the strings, is as mentioned by Sexton.
Yeah, well, and that was one of the this committee is largely made up of Republicans, but it does have some Democratic representation, including State Senator Ramesh Akbari from Memphis. And she said that her entire role on this committee is going to spend the whole time saying, this is a bad idea. We shouldn't do this. And her big concern is that A, it could take money away from low income students and communities. And B, it could force a lot of those districts to have to raise taxes in order to make up what they would be losing in the federal funding. Because there's no guarantee that even if the state in absolute dollars made up the difference, that it would come to the same schools and the same students and so forth. So, we will see what comes out of all of that. There's also some background noise from the state that actually sales tax and tax receipts so far this year are running maybe a little bit behind what had been projected. I think they're saying there's like a $300 million gap right now. That's relatively small compared to the big surplus that the state does have. But at a time when you're seeing, we got these big jumps in sales tax revenues coming out of the pandemic, and those are clearly flattening out. And so in a time when you're seeing that surplus probably maybe plateauing, not growing as fast, is this really something the state would want to take on?
And you have a lot of conversation on the national level of a potential recession and blah, 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 blah. And are we going to have the same December receipts that we've had in the past, considering the greater economic picture and how that will affect that gap or grow it moving forward?
Yeah, lots of uncertainty there. But it was an interesting contrast between, on the one hand, the state being really angry about losing this, $7 or $8 million in funding for reproductive health. And of course, a lot of that anger was because specifically of that money going to Planned Parenthood. But, making a lot of noise about losing this $8 million in federal funding. And then on the other hand, saying, maybe we could give up this $2 billion over here.
Take your $2 billion and shove it.
Right. As long as you don't come back and give that $2 billion to Planned Parenthood. That's what they really don't want to see. Anyway, we will, of course, see what happens with both of those in the future. Let's go ahead and take a break now, and then we will come back and rejoin our friend Scott. Okay, we are now to the Q&A portion of the podcast, and we are going to be rejoined here by Mr. Barker. Every week we go on to the subscriber-only Compass Facebook group, the Compass Colloquy, which you can join if you are a subscriber, which you can become at CompassKnox.com. And we ask our readers if there are any stray bits of information, topics, or anything else they would like to hear talked about on the podcast. We had a couple of questions this week. One of them was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think is actually worth delving into a little. One of our readers asked, and this is specific to people living within the city of Knoxville, he asked, we are allowed to have chickens in the backyard because Knoxville does have an urban hen ordinance. Are we, or why are we not, allowed to have other kinds of animals that people might like to keep, like a goat or a cow or pigs? And so, this is an interesting and somewhat tendentious topic when it comes to city neighborhoods. People keeping various kinds of animals in their neighborhoods, in their backyards. And I don't know how many of our listeners maybe were around back when the city of Knoxville adopted its urban hen ordinance, but that was actually itself fairly tendentious. There were a lot of people who had concerns about their neighborhoods being overrun with chickens and so forth. And the rules around chickens in the backyard are actually pretty strict. They have to be kept in a coop. I think you can have them out to some degree, but they've got to be within the confines of the yard. And you can't have roosters because we don't want roosters crowing all over our city neighborhoods every morning. And they have, there has to be setbacks from the property line and all these kinds of things. And chickens pretty much are probably the least obtrusive animals that you could have in a city neighborhood. And I think the reason that other kinds of animals are not allowed is exactly because, A, they tend to be larger, they tend to be noisier, they tend to be smellier, And Scott, we were talking earlier about the the middle housing and the fact that a lot of those older city neighborhoods have quite small lots. And so, if you were in one of those neighborhoods and your next door neighbor had a pig or something over the fence, it could pretty easily intrude on your quality of life.
Yeah, and quite frankly, cows need a lot more space than most city lots can afford. So,
yeah, I mean, out in Montana where they graze cows, I forget the actual amount of number of acres per cow that's supposed to be allotted, but it's a lot.
Yeah, it would be cruel and unusual for me to have a cow in my backyard. It's so small. So so I mean, the things like cows, horses, things like that are kind of self-explanatory. Just the sheer space. Although there is I haven't been over near this place in a while, but a pony up in Oakwood Lincoln Park. So I don't know if it's still there, but but yeah, I mean, it's Knoxville's a city, and there are just a lot of animals that aren't really suitable for the city. So horses.
Now, of course,
cows,
historically,
goats.
right, we did used to, if you go back 100 years in the city of Knoxville, it was actually pretty common for people to keep all sorts of animals, and we lived a little bit more, even within our cities in those days, we lived a little bit more of a agricultural lifestyle. A lot of people grew their own vegetables and had their own animals. But right, as we codified various kinds of ordinances over the past 100 years, there were a lot of restrictions placed on that.
Yeah, and I would imagine that there were quite a few neighborly disputes, some of which could have ended violently over animals that strayed into the wrong yard and things like that. Because you also had in those days the idea that you just don't step foot into someone else's property wasn't quite as rigid as it is today. So.
Right. Well, and there is one exception to the no animals but chickens rule, which is you are allowed to rent for a defined period of time goats to come onto private property, specifically for the purpose of basically, as we know, goats will sort of like eat everything that is available to them. And so the city itself actually has used goats to clear some vacant lots of brush and vines and so forth. But if you do that, that's very regulated, and they also have to be kept within a certain area, and they can only be there for a limited period of time. I had an interesting experience when I worked for the city on this issue, which was my office at the time was sort of if you went up to the 6th floor of the city county building and turned right, my office was the first office you came to off the elevator, and I was right there and always had my door open. And so I got a lot of walk-in traffic from people who were just trying to figure out where to go to get a question answered. And I had a family stop by once, a husband and wife and a couple of small children who were Iraqi refugees who had just showed up, just gotten settled and I guess assigned to Knoxville, Knox County. And they were in temporary housing at the time, and they were trying to kind of figure out where they wanted to live, to look for housing. And they spoke kind of limited English, but we were able to have a conversation. And their big question really revolved around where can we keep animals? And so, again, kind of thinking back to what we would call maybe more traditional ways of life, they were moving from somewhere in Iraq where every family just had a little menagerie of animals. They had some chickens, they had some, I don't know, goats and other things. And so that was the lifestyle they were accustomed to. And as a representative of the city, once I kind of realized what they were looking for, I really had to tell them, well, you probably don't actually want to be in city limits. If you want to be able to keep a lot of animals, I would really recommend looking somewhere outside the city with agricultural zoning, because of course there is a lot more freedom outside city limits, but what you run into there is that in a lot of neighborhoods, subdivisions, and so forth, that kind of thing is restricted by housing covenants, the homeowners associations and so forth. And so it's not like you can just move out to a subdivision in Halls or Powell or someplace and, keep a couple of goats. Like, that's probably going to be restricted by the HOA. But if you go out to agricultural zoned property, obviously that's where you can, it's specifically and explicitly zoned for animals.
Yeah, now I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I was under, I haven't looked this up in a long time, but I believe you can keep Vietnamese potbelly pigs.
Right, yes. But they have to be real within the city. Yes, you can, because they are small pet, quote unquote, toy animals, but they have to be real pot-bellied pigs. And the problem that people run into with this is that there are a lot of pigs that are sold as pot-bellied pigs that are actually, hybrids, mixtures. And so you buy something thinking it's a pot-bellied pig that's going to max out at, I forget, 80 pounds or whatever they get up to. And instead it turns out to be something that's going to grow to, 200 or 300 pounds. And that becomes a much different proposition. All right, taking a quick look ahead to the coming week, we do have a handful of civic meetings of various kinds. The school board is going to be having its monthly meetings on a slightly different schedule. They're going to have their monthly work session as usual Monday at 5 p.m., but the voting meeting is actually going to be Wednesday, October 4th at 5 p.m. rather than on Thursday. That was moved because there were a couple of board members who had conflicting schedules. So if you are a school board devotee, just set your calendar for Wednesday instead of Thursday. They do have a couple of interesting things on the agenda. They have a proposal to buy about 40 acres of land in Farragut for just under $5 million from commercial developer Doug Horn. This is, I think they're hoping this is the resolution to, they've been looking for property for a new elementary school in Farragut to take some of the crowding pressure off of the Farragut elementary schools. And they had one property earlier in the year that kind of fell through. And so this is where they have settled. They are also going to be adopting the updated action plan, as we talked about earlier, for the current year. And then also an interesting resolution by school board member Jennifer Owen that would guarantee the right of teachers and school employees to talk to and address and petition public officials about issues that are important to them, and probably specifically issues having to do with education, to basically ensure their right of free speech and their rights as school employees to express their opinions and their thoughts to their elected officials. And so this is being put in place probably to protect against any fear that teachers might feel if they speak up over some issue that they might suffer some kind of consequences. So that is on the agenda. Both that'll be talked about. Both of those will be talked about at the work session on Monday and then voted on Wednesday. And both of those meetings are in the Summer Place boardroom. And then Scott, City Council meets on Tuesday.
City Council doesn't meet on Tuesday. The agenda at this point doesn't look like there are too many blockbuster issues coming up, although it is kind of a streetscapes day. There's a contract with CDM Smith for an actual $1.1 million city streetscapes program. So far, they've kind of worked on the area west of Jackson Avenue, or west of Central Street along Jackson Avenue. This is going to be along Central Street and to the east, along Central and Willow, or along Jackson and Willow, from there to the bridge. This will have the added benefit, as far as the city is concerned, as beautifying the streets and putting utilities underground in the approaches to the new stadium. So that's going to be on the agenda. And also there's another an extra $124,000 is going toward First Creek Greenway project. They're going to be looking at the bridge across Woodland Avenue to make improvements there. This is kind of more design work than anything else. Then there are going to be some other things on the agenda, but those are kind of the two of the bigger outlays of funding that they're going to be talking about. Then on Thursday, the Knox County Planning Commission is going to meet. For those who follow the Planning Commission religiously, they will note that this is a week earlier than usual. Most of their meetings the second week of the month. This one's the first week of the month. But at that meeting, they are going to be considering the mayor's middle housing plan that we talked about earlier, and also proposals from developer and city council candidate R. Bentley Marlowe to change the zoning code to allow this middle housing to be built on more areas all across the city. So these will be considered separately. He proposed doing this on his own, using his own money to pay the fees. So we won't go into the kind of tortured history of how that's been looked at so far, but the Planning Commission will take a look at these amendment proposals that he's put forward. Like the mayor's plan, if they approve it, it will go to city council for a vote later on. There's also one other kind of item. A while back, there'd been a proposal for the McNabb Center to take over the old South High School, which is now a senior living facility. McNabb Center was going to take that over and transform it into a drug treatment facility. There was a lot of pushback from the neighborhood. They ended up withdrawing that. Now they're going to the Planning Commission to get permission to greatly expand their Northwest Knoxville facility that already exists. It's going to go from a little fewer than 50 units to or beds to 72 beds is what they're wanting, because the opioid crisis, of course, continues on, and there's a huge need for more beds, more treatment facilities in Knoxville and Knox County. And if they could go to the old South High School building, they're going to expand the one they're in now, and that will be on the agenda as well. And then, of course, the usual assortment of rezonings and plans approvals and those kinds of things.
All right. Well, I think that wraps us up for this week. We will be back next week to talk about those things and anything else that happens in the interim. And Scott will be joining us back in person again. In the meantime, Scott, I hope you have a great visit down there in Tybee Island. I do understand that, as you say, you're on assignment. This is not a junket.
It is not fun at all. Let me tell you.
Well, I hope that hanging out at the beach doesn't take too much of a toll on you. And we will be back to talk to everybody next week. Our producer is Lord Seth Barber, Barbarian Productions. Our theme music is by Will Wright. And we'll talk to you later.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.